Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we gather to coherent dialogues at the life's edge of what matters most. And I'm your MC for today, Raven Connolly. Really happy to be here with Wolfgang Palaver, who is a René Girard scholar and an author of a book on René Girard's mimetic theory. So today, just the structure of our event. We're going to have a 20-minute talk from Wolfgang, and then we'll move into a Q&A with the audience. If you want to place a question in the chat, just put a little Q beforehand and type out your question. And then in the Q&A, I will call on you if you wish to have a dialogue with Wolfgang, and you can ask your question with him. And with that, Wolfgang, we'll move over to your presentation on René Girard.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion and this talk. I'm usually teaching in Austria in the University of Innsbruck, but since a week I'm now in Stellenbosch in South Africa for the next couple of months to work on Mahatma Gandhi nonviolence from a Girardian perspective. So what I will do now is lay out some of the basics of René Girard's mimetic theory, also try to address some of the issues in our today's world for which René Girard's anthropology is hopefully helpful. And then I'm open for discussion, whatever question you have, I try to answer if I can. I divided my short introduction into 3 steps because the usual presentation of Girard's mimetic theory shows that you can present it with the help of 3 pillars of 3 main parts of this theory. And the first part, probably the most important part, is his insight about the importance of mimetic desire or imitative desire. I mean, imitation is observed and discussed in the Western tradition from the very early beginnings of Greek philosophy onwards. But the new thing that Girard brings to light is how imitation or mimesis or mimetic is connected to desire. So Girard was probably the first one who showed how we human beings are, especially in our desires, as soon as the basic needs are fulfilled, we turn to our neighbors, to others, to people we admire and want to have the same things, the same objects of desire. One of the oldest insights in this regard, which comes very close to René Girard's mimetic theory, was observed and formulated by Plato, but also by Augustine, that human beings imitate what they adore. We imitate what we adore, and if we adore something or someone, it's very difficult not to imitate. Is this relevant for observing things and dynamics in our world of today? I think, yes, of course, it's very important. Just look at fashion. Fashion is something that strongly operates with mimetic desire. Usually advertisements, for instance, commercials do not work by addressing or showing us the object we should buy. They show us cool people who have certain objects, and those cool people, they orient our own desire to the objects the cool people, those people we adore, have. We can also look at the social media, the phenomenon of social media. Social medias are also deeply governed by mimetic desire, by imitation. When we are on Facebook, we look how many likes we got, how many people have shared our insights. So also the dimension that human beings are comparing or like to compare each other with one another is also part of this emphasis on mimetic or imitative desire. If we look at science, just about 15 years ago, scientists discovered the so-called mirror neurons, which also shows that our brain is in some way hardwired for this mirroring of others, for imitation, for mimesis. Now, if we think about how human learning works, if we think about how human thinking works, how human thinking develops, how human beings develop into human beings, we also realize quickly that human beings develop into human beings by mirroring other human beings. I mean, I think in the 18th, 19th century, they did some cruel experiments by splitting off children from any contact with human beings, and those poor children, they died like animals. They never became human beings, because human beings are relational beings. So we need these mirror neurons. We need this capability of mirroring other in order to develop our language skills, to develop the way we think, the way we grow up as human beings. So it is very important, because very often Girard's mimetic theory is described as a negative anthropology, as an anthropology that just emphasizes violence. And in one of his books, he claims, justly so, that mimetic desire is intrinsically good. So mimetic desire is intrinsically good. But he does not overlook that mimetic desire easily also can cause conflicts, can cause mimetic rivalries, can even turn to violence and even escalate to violence, can draw us into a spiral of violence. So we have to look at the preconditions, how mimetic desire can develop into this negative version of mimetic rivalry and mimetically induced violence. And I think there are mainly two preconditions. The first one is depends on the quality or the essence of the goal of our desire. If the object of our desire that we share with others, that we share by imitating others, is an object that cannot be divided, that cannot be shared, we easily get into troubles, into rivalries, and into a negative spiral. So that's the first preconditions, and it's not by chance. If we look, for instance, at the Christian tradition for a long time distinguished between temporal goods and eternal goods, and temporal goods are getting us more easily into troubles, whereas eternal goods, at least by definition of those goods, it depends again on the way we approach them, should bring us closer together. And that's not only true for Christianity. I mean, part of the research project I do here in South Africa, by looking at the writings of Gandhi, is that also Gandhi, for instance, from a Hindu perspective, understood this distinction between eternal and temporal goods. The second precondition is the closeness between subject and model. So you only get into trouble if you really can easily compare yourself with your possible rival. The closer the subject and the model get to each other, the more likely it is that their relation becomes rivalrous. If we look anthropologically at the main source of human violence, of human conflicts, we can easily find it in sibling rivalry. Sibling rivalry is one of the main causes of problems between human beings. Former English rabbi who deceased just a couple of months ago, Jonathan Sacks, wrote a very important book on religiously motivated violence with the title Not in God's Name. And he just studies the first book of the Hebrew Bible, the book of Genesis, and shows us, beginning with Cain and Abel, but Joseph and his brothers, and many more examples, how sibling rivalry is already at the center of this book. But he shows also how these problems coming along with sibling rivalry can be overcome. You can also go to a more modern thinker, the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, observed that neighbor countries, neighbor regions, most of the time are more in rivalry than regions or countries far apart. He said, I cannot really explain this phenomenon, but I observe it again and again. And he, of course, was also thinking about rivalries between Christian and Jews, which are also two religions that are in a brotherly relationship, in a sibling relationship, but easily, at least from the Christian side, turned into a dangerous, violent relationship. So Sigmund Freud called that narcissism of small differences. And he said, it's clear you can observe this phenomenon all over the world, all over history, but I cannot really explain the deeper reason for it. And I think mimetic theory also observes narcissism of small differences, but can explain it with the help of this concept of mimetic desire. Now also violence is very prone to this kind of imitative contagion. I would say that violence is one of the human dimensions and realities that's most contagious. So if we behave violently, the chance that other people will also react in violence and that we are easily drawn into a spiral of violence, we can observe throughout history and all over the time. Girard's last book, which was reflecting on the German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, shows how easily violence can escalate to extremes. His book, Girard's book on this matter, has the title Battling to the End. Girard himself claims that this is an apocalyptic book, his most apocalyptic book, and it was originally published in France in 2007. And many readers, students also of Girard, even partly myself, thought this book is a little bit too gloomy. This book is a little bit too much into apocalyptic thinking. But if you think about recent political developments all over the world since 2007, the last 13 years, then there were quite some events that confirmed Girard's rather gloomy view. Maybe we have already forgotten, but just a couple of years we had the Islamic State, a very dangerous terrorist development, and we had wars fighting this Islamic State, and we had, of course, an escalation of violence in the Near East, which in some way caused this political vacuum there that created in some way indirectly this Islamic State. We can also talk about climate change. We can talk about the increase of resentment leading to populist movements all over the world. We see it hopefully only until tomorrow in the United States. We see it in Brazil, we see it in India, we see it in many European countries. This increase of resentment and right-wing populism is also probably caused by this increase of competition coming from mimetic rivalries. An Indian English writer, Pankaj Mishra, wrote a couple of years ago a book with the title The Age of Anger, where he reflects on those resentments, on those populisms, and he draws again and again to the work and insights of René Girard. After 9/11, Girard explained global terrorism as the result of a planetary mimetic crisis, as an outcome of an increase of global competition. And I think this thesis is superior to Huntington's clash of civilizations. Dangers are not so much coming along with a clash of civilizations, but with what we can call, in following Girard, global civil war. So that's the first pillar of mimetic theory I want to introduce you to. The second pillar is the overcoming of the scapegoat mechanism by siding with the victim. Girard distinguished in his work between early religions that stem from the so-called scapegoat mechanism on the one hand and the biblical revelation on the other. Girard claimed that there is a religion that comes from man, that's early religion. He also called it the sacred. And then there is a religion that comes from God that he identifies with the term holy. And we have to study with the help of Girard how early religions worked, how they developed. And these early religions stem from a scapegoat mechanism when a member of a tribe who was in a crisis because of rivalries was killed or expelled. But the interesting thing that we probably do not understand immediately from our modern perspective is that those early tribes turned their scapegoats later on into divinities of their tribes, because these scapegoats not only were accused of causing all the troubles inside the tribe, but also as the provider and giver of peace after he was killed or expelled. So the scapegoat was turned into a sacred divinity. We should not mix it up now with what we understand by God, by turning towards the modern world religions, so to say. But we have to understand the sacred. And by turning the scapegoat into the tribal divinity, these early cultures were able to project their own violence towards another realm and keep a certain peace with a small amount of violence. With the development of structural violence, kept these tribal communities relatively peaceful. And now, when Girard turns towards biblical religions, he realizes that the biblical religions, especially Judaism and Christianity, but today we can even bring all those world religions into view, that these religions in some way uncover the mechanism of those early religions by siding with the persecuted victims, with the victims of collective persecution. In this regard, Girard comes very close to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche in the 19th century became fully aware that the difference between Greek myth and the Bible is not so much that they talk about different things. Both these texts often talk about collective persecution of single victims. The difference is how these events are interpreted. And in the case of the Greek myth of the old sacred, the victims are not rehabilitated. The perspective is not siding with the victims. The perspective is siding with the persecutors. But in the case of the world religions, in Girard's eyes, especially in Judaism and Christianity, the text sides with the victims of persecution, which we see most clearly in the Passion of Christ. Now, what is the outcome? What follows from this biblical insight, so to say? There follows something very good and something very dangerous. The good thing is that our awareness of victimization, our siding with victims, modern human rights, is an outcome of this change of perspective. But at the same time, by uncovering the mechanism of the early sacred, we also lost the protection against our own violence. So we no longer can build a relative peace on this type of structural violence. But so we have to deal more deeply with potentials of human violence. So you can say, as Girard often claimed, that the modern world is the best and the worst world we ever had. And what is the best thing? That's the legacy of the human rights. That's the legacy of our more and more siding with victims. But the worst is that we are living in a world where it's not impossible that the whole world will end up in a nuclear apocalypse by escalating human violence, wars, terrorism, or also the climate change, that the apocalypse that can come along with climate change. And it's interesting also to understand our world that this siding with victims is even true for movements we would not suspect that they would side with victims. I talk about terrorist groups. There is no terrorist group in our world of today who does not claim to defend victims to justify their own violence. And even the Nazis in Germany, they seem to be on the one hand longing for a return to the mythic world, to the old sacred. But as George Orwell observed in his review of Hitler's book Mein Kampf, even Hitler himself presented him as a victim that justifies the actions he does. So we see that this change of the perspective that comes along with the biblical legacy and maybe with the legacy of the world religions by siding with the victims changed the perspective of our world. And I would claim we cannot go back to the sacred of early religions. And I conclude with a rather short third point. That's the third pillar in my description and explanation of Girard's mimetic theory. And this is, on the one hand, his distinction between the sacred and the holy. That is highly relevant in an age of the return of religion into the sphere of politics. This third pillar of Girard's mimetic theory contains a theory of religion, and I think it's also highly relevant. Often, if you go back the last 100 or 150 years, often the modern view of religion was that religion is a singular concept. And one of the most prominent thinkers who developed this single understanding of religion was the French sociologist of religion, Émile Durkheim, who said, religion is in some way identical with the society. And this is not completely wrong, because if we study the early sacred, we can really confirm what Durkheim claimed about religion. But if we see religion in this singular way, we have troubles to understand why religion can be a source of violence, but at the same time can also be a source of peace. Religion can help to provide peace, and religion can also incite conflicts and violence. So the singular concept now forced people, thinkers like, for instance, Scott Appleby, to develop a concept of the ambivalence of the sacred. So saying religion as such is per se ambiguous. And I think that's not a very helpful concept, because then it would turn religion in something basically and fundamentally irrational or non-rational. And there were thinkers like Rudolf Otto who exactly did that. I prefer a French thinker who challenged Émile Durkheim's concept. And I'm referring to the last book of a famous French philosopher, Henri Bergson. And Henri Bergson studied Durkheim, and in his last book, the two sources of morality and religion from 1932, he said, well, Durkheim is only half right, because he overlooks that there are two different types of religion. And I see an important continuity between Bergson and Girard, and I just published 2 weeks ago a book with the title Transforming the Sacred into Saintliness. And it's a reflection on violence and religion with the help of René Girard, where I show this connection between Henri Bergson and René Girard. Henri Bergson observed that there are two very different, fundamentally different types of religion that we can observe in history and the world. The first type of religion is this tribal type of religion. It's called by Bergson static religion, and it goes along with closed societies. And it's roughly identical with what Girard described as the sacred. But there is another type of religion, Bergson called it dynamic religion, that goes along and leads to the open society, and that's close to what Girard called the holy in his last book. In Girard's eyes, religion will not disappear, as Marcel Gauchet has claimed with his thesis that Christianity will lead to the end of religion, but there will be two types of religion. And against Gauchet's thesis, Girard maintained that our celebrated humanism will turn out to have been nothing but a brief intermission between two forms of religion. And I'm very strongly emphasizing now this distinction between the sacred and the holy, because it's very important to develop theologies to understand the connection between violence and religion, between politics and religion. We need more dynamic religion and we need much less static religion, but we are still in a situation of a lot of mixings between these two types of religion. So that's my short introduction into mimetic theory, and whatever questions you have, I try to give you an answer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Wolfgang. That was amazing and so dense. The first kind of question that comes to mind for me, and I'll just warm up the crowd a little bit, is actually I'm thinking about another Catholic genius of the 20th century, Marshall McLuhan, how he talked about the electric era being the creation of the global village. And if we think about mimetic desire, the village is where you begin to form those intimate relationships of imitation, but also rivalry. So what do you see as the effects of all of us being brought into a participatory global village of digital communication and the interaction with mimetic desire and the scapegoat mechanism? What's the view of the internet and how it's impacting us from a Girardian standpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the last thing I did when I was in Austria still a week ago was to go to the library and look at the article of Marshall McLuhan where he talks about in an interview about the global village, because in some way Marshall McLuhan is very close to Girard's thesis that our modern world is the worst and the best at the same time. Because in one sense, Marshall McLuhan thought the electronic age will enable us to build a global mystical body of Christ. So all will be connected. We will share the suffering. We will share the joy. And it will be really what is described in traditional Christianity, the body of Christ, or the mystical body of Christ. But then in an interview with Mr. Stern, he was asked, are you really so optimistic about the global village? And in this interview, he just said the reverse. I mean, he talks about the mystical body, but then he says the global village will be full of resentment, will be full of envy, and the neighbors will sneak into your privacy. And in this global village, we would again long to go into the city where we will be anonymous and not in that sense confronted by neighbors who steal our privacy and become envious and so on. So I would say, I mean, the more we create, and this is a good thing, equality, democracy in our world, and communicate and connect with each other, the more we turn our world, and that's also the development towards an open society, towards this global village. But the more we go towards a global village, the more we should be aware of an increase of possible mimetic rivalries. So that means if we go in that direction, we need to develop our characters and our moral behavings in a way we never did before. And I think we are just in that situation. Those social media show us how dangerous they can be if the users do not behave in a way we have never behaved before.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to turn to audience questions. We're going to start with Hal. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question to Wolfgang?
Yeah, I actually have I have two questions. The questions are, and I put them in the chat. The first one is, where does Girard fit into the broader framework of French structuralism and debates over subjectivity? How does his theory of desire compare to that of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari? And the other question was really, how do we come up with a morality that can be shared, like you just said, a morality that doesn't just become competitive virtue signaling itself? So then that just becomes another form of mimetic competition. And I'm asking this as a humanist and somebody who believes there can be an open society. There are people probably here who are much more skeptical of that in and of itself.
Thank you very much for your very important questions. So the first one is, Girard comes out of French structuralism. So just in the beginning, he organized in, I think, 1966, when he was at Johns Hopkins University, the first big American conference called the Structuralist Controversy, where Derrida for the first time gave a very important paper on the North American continent, where key thinkers were there. But quickly, Girard, in some sense, uses structural methods to understand literary text, to uncover the working of mimetic desire. But contrary to most of those thinkers, he also insisted that texts have a connection to reality. So for him, texts are not just a textual play between texts, but texts have a connection to reality. I mean, it's not a direct and easy connection, but if you lose the connection between reality and the text, you also got in a quite troubled version of postmodern thinking. So I think that the first thing, I mean, I cannot now really give you a precise answer about his position on Deleuze and Guattari, but in his book, To Double Business Bound, there is a long 40 pages essay on Deleuze and Guattari concerning the interpretation of the Oedipus myth. So again, I think one of the things was that Girard was always claiming the connection to reality, but I would not dare now to go deeper into that question. And the second question is also very important, and I mean, that remains a big problem. Of course, I mean, an old Christian saying always said, corruptio optimi pessima. That means the corruption of the best will turn into the worst. So if we say, and if I claim that we need more morality, of course, morality can quickly turn also into a weapon, can quickly be used as a weapon. So we have to be aware of that, the way we use morality. And let me, because I emphasize so strongly the distinction between the sacred and the holy. An important German philosopher, Max Scheler, showed us, and that's also important for mimetic desire, that the value of the holy can unite people, whereas material values easily turn us into adversaries. That's clear. If we go for money, there is always someone who has more money, or we cannot share. If we go for a worldly position, political position, or position in a university, we are easily into conflict. So the holy, and that was also an insight by Augustine, does not necessarily turn us into adversaries. But then Max Scheler himself said, but what about the religious wars? So again, it's very important how we approach the holy. And as soon as we approach God or the holy or eternal values as something like a property that we can have and own just for ourselves, or if I would claim that I know as the only person in the world what the Christian God really means for us, then we are quickly into rivalry, because there will be justly so other theologians who would say, well, I see it a little bit different, and then the fights go on. So if we turn towards morality, towards the holy, we have to do it in a humble way. And we have to start with ourselves. So it's not so much preaching morality to others, it's trying to overcome the temptations in ourselves. And this is the hardest thing to do, as far as I can tell you.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to read this question on behalf of David. What is the relation between Girard's mimetic theory and Dawkins' mimetic theory? How are they the same or different? Is one a subset of the other?
Again, I could not give you a really precise answer. I mean, I would say the Dawkins is rather a subset, because it just talks about certain kind of repetitions, so cultural memes, cultural ideas that can be imitated or are imitated. But Girard would see it in a much broader sense, and would see the positive side and the negative side of it. So he would see how important mimetic relations, mirroring others, is for our own personal development. But he would also closely see how easily we can turn into, the whole thing can turn into rivalry. And I do not have it now in my mind. I think I found a footnote in Dawkins' book. He doesn't talk a lot about envy, which is in some way interesting, because as soon as you reflect on mimetic mirroring patterns, you can talk about empathy, but you have to talk about envy also. And he doesn't talk that much about envy, so see it rather as an exception and doesn't take it seriously. And maybe that's related, because that comes to my mind immediately if I think about Dawkins, that his view of religion is quite narrow and not really very good. So it's just a propaganda, what he writes about religion. Sorry, maybe there is more to say to that than with more competence, but I could not now out of the box give you a very precise answer. But I would roughly say the mimetic theory is a subset.
Great, that's a good place. I'm going to go do some research right there. Okay, we're going to move to Laura's question. Laura, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. I had a question, and then as you gave the presentation, I became more and more curious about your work on Gandhi and nonviolence, and just trying to imagine, yeah, what a imitation that's not, yeah, imitating violence. And it kind of seems like nonviolence would be an alternate form of imitation or something. But so I'm curious, I'd be curious to hear you talk about that. But my question was, just as Girard, how does he distinguish kind of a mimetic desire that's just a form, kind of lacking a sense of inner sensibility or of ethos or spirit, from one that's a kind of more total transformation? I was thinking of like Don Quixote or Madame Bovary, who both seem to be, you know, imitating literary figures and kind of sensibilities without a sense of the internal core of it and getting into problems. So yeah, I was just curious.
I mean, the first thing that is important in view, for instance, of those two literary works you mentioned, is Girard's distinction between external and internal mimesis. So the external mimesis, if you imitate a literary figure, who may have never existed or has died hundreds years ago, you don't get into mimetic rivalry, of course, because it's too far away. So the closeness, that is the second precondition for rivalries, is not there. And the problem gets really worse as soon as you imitate a person that is close to you. So that's an important distinction. So Don Quixote is in an early stage. It's the first modern novel, so to say. But the first book of Girard goes from Cervantes to Dostoevsky. And the apocalyptic family relationships in Dostoevsky are, so to say, on the other end of the spectrum. So he talks about the brothers Karamazov, when you have the situation that a son and a father desire the same woman, which is quite a problematic thing, even without Freud and all the other things that you can bring into the thing. But in a more general way, Girard, here and there, when he was asked what should we do, he strongly emphasized sainthood, saintliness, so that he said, I mean, it's very important what kind of models we imitate. And I mean, those models are most important who were not models of self-interest and egoistic desires and so on, but had a different type of desire. And if you follow them, you cannot get into trouble, or not easily into trouble, and you can get on a path that avoids probably those typical entanglements. So we should think about saintly people, and I would say in some way Gandhi is a example as a person in this regard. So when he again and again talked about disenchantment, when he talks about what is the right term? Detachment, that's the right term. When he talks about detachment, if saintly people walk on a path of detachment, that helps also ourselves to detach a little bit from those worldly things that are so dangerous in some way for us. And maybe a last remark, I'm very excited again and again about Henri Bergson, because when Bergson distinguishes between static religion and dynamic religion, he also distinguishes between a collective religion, a tribal religion on the one hand, and a much more individualistic, mystic path. But when he talks about mysticism, he talks not so much about contemplation, but about active fighting for justice. And then he talks how do those mystics bring this different type of religion into our world. And then he talks also about imitation. And he says, those people, extraordinary people like Jesus, like Buddha, probably today like Gandhi, like Saint Francis, they can show us a way of life that that can bring out an echo in us. So most of the people, and it's true for myself, I have not yet had any kind of mystical experience, and I don't expect in the remaining years that there will come one. And that's the typical situation of most of the people. A famous philosopher of religion, an American philosopher of religion, William James, who was a friend of Bergson, talked about that and said, I have no mystical experiences, but if I turn to those extraordinary saintly people, they call an echo in myself. So I feel suddenly that is a very important thing. So that's also in a broad sense a form of imitation that can bring those good things into our world.
Could I just ask a follow-up? Just brief. Just what's the book that Bergson talks about mysticism and fighting for justice?
Yeah, all what I said about Bergson is the two sources of morality and religion. So it's already important that he talks about two sources. And it was, of course, the title was also a rebuttal of Durkheim, who only sees one single simple religion that explains all. And Bergson said, no, there are two. We have to distinguish those two. And he talks about the First World War, the 19th century, and said this is a mixed phenomenon because the Christian countries like France and Germany, who fought the war against each other, both proclaimed to believe in the Christian God, which is a universal God, which should make a war between those two countries impossible. But the way they understood this God was how you understand a tribal God. So the God was still a tribal God, despite the fact that it was the God of monotheism and universality.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to Jeff. Jeff Loveland, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate this, Wolfgang. Everything's been, super interesting and compelling. My question for you is, are there one or two things that intermediate levels of students of Girard get wrong, who have an otherwise good intuitive grasp and understanding of his work, that they might then get right after a multi-year, more comprehensive study of kind of the corpus of his writings and his discussions? Thank you.
I think there are two dangers, and I observe them very often. The first I already referred to shortly, that very often Girard is seen as someone who is in favor of violence or sees violent nature of human beings, or see mimetic desire as nothing but negative. So, I mean, there are some parts in his work, if you just read them, you can get the impression that he's going in that direction. But then I always quote the sentence I quoted also today, that mimetic desire is intrinsically good. And you always have to see this sentence and this insight up front, and then you can turn to all the conflictual dimensions, but you should never forget that intrinsically it's good. And it's also, of course, from a Christian or biblical perspective, if that would not be the case, we would be in an ontology of violence. We would see the whole creation of being a violent creation. So that's the first danger by approaching Girard. The second is more difficult, and I also refer to it indirectly, but very shortly. Of course, we observe all over the place and in our families and our own life types of scapegoating. And Girard talks a lot about, when he studies the sacred of early religions, the scapegoat mechanism. But the scapegoat mechanism he describes in regard to early religion is not the same as when we talk about scapegoating in a family, in a school class, in a faculty or whatever, because, as I said, the scapegoating in early religions has this double transference. So all the bad things are projected onto the scapegoat, but also the good things. And in our modern world, we cannot understand how a scapegoat that we think is responsible for all the evils can turn into someone we adore. So that's very important to see this difference between the mechanism of early religions and modern types of scapegoating. So in that sense, modern types of scapegoating are much more dangerous, because for us, an evil person is just evil, nothing but evil. So therefore, we hunt down scapegoats even more cruelly and brutally than ever before. And that's the protective side of those religions, which were, of course, religions of violence, which even had human sacrifices very often, were bloody religions, but they had a protective side. And we have to understand that protective side, that we see what we lost. We cannot go back to that. And it's also good in some way that we don't, that we cannot go back to these bloody types of religion, but they had a protective side that we easily overlook. So this moralization that is going on, that if we politically and so on see a person as really evil, we immediately say this person is absolutely evil. And in these early religions, there is not so much a moral dimension to that. He might be by determination, by whatever reason, in this special status, but it's not like this moralistic attitude. And of course, morality came much more into our world with the world religions, with the biblical religions. And this is an advantage, but also a big danger. And we have to face the danger that comes along with a moral attitude. I don't know if that
that was super illuminating. Yeah, thank you for that. And that slots in very nicely with one of the things that you had said earlier that I thought was super evocative, which was morality as a weapon. So again,
right. I mean, you know this term victimology. So today there is a global competition who is most victimized, and which is the shadow side of our concern for victims. The concern for victims is the best that we have developed in our world, but if it becomes a weapon, it's a very dangerous thing. And terrorism is one of the examples for this victimology.
Great. Okay, I think we maybe have time for one more question. We can sneak one in. And the next one in the line is Brendan. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. What was my question? Just 1 second, I have it here somewhere. Oh yeah. Does Girard say anything about the manipulation of mimetic desire and how it might be controlled? I'm thinking in terms of the Social Dilemma documentary.
The Social Dilemma, is this on social media, or is this documentary that was in Netflix, right?
Yeah. Will I tell you briefly about the part that concerns this question?
Yes, please.
What it says is that the platform providers collect the data about the similar-minded people on the internet, you know, from tracking their cookies and all that, you know. And I was thinking, when you spoke about mimetics, I thought immediately, yes, well, we might say these people are mirroring each other in their desires. And from the algorithms then that the platform providers have, they serve up these people as collections of people who all see things more or less the same. And the problem, if I understand the documentary right, the problem arises when content is then provided for the advertisers to attract even more people.
Yeah.
And this then is said to be how the online world is actually creating the likes of the ideologies that we have nowadays. And they want to, of course, control what's going on because of the danger in it. And I was wondering, did Girard say anything about these issues?
Not really, because, you know, more or less Girard stopped working. He was already quite old in about 2007, 2008. I think the last interview was 2009. And then he was also quite ill and no longer able to work. And this was just the time when the social media started. I mean, 2007 was the first iPhone, and then the whole thing began. So it's a very new development, but I'm quite aware of these things because I'm teaching for about 16 years computer science students in Innsbruck and teach an ethics course there. And I was following for a long time those things, and I always introduce mimetic theory to them. And one of the books that I would recommend, it's a small book by Sharon Lanier, 10 reasons why you should quit your social media account. I think that's the title of the book. And of course, you can look into the internet and you see that I have not canceled my accounts. And, and I have to explain to the students that I said, at least we should be aware how dangerous those things can be and how dangerous they are in the way they are working right now. Because the main danger is that those social media platforms are interested in emotions. Those platforms are not evil per se, but those platforms want to get your attention. And because of our emotional, relational way how human beings are, the more negative emotions are involved, the more attention human beings, the more attentive human beings become. So, for instance, YouTube is a media, the desire of YouTube is to keep you watching YouTube videos as long as possible. So the algorithms give you just those things. They see that you got excited and you watch more and more. And that creates very dangerous emotional potentials, that creates divisions, that creates tribal groups. And I think mimetic theory is very helpful because mimetic theory knows the dangers of desires, the dangers of group scapegoating, bullying, all those things. And I think the next couple of years we have to develop ways how those social media, those platforms can become platforms that are more prone to support positive relationships and not platforms that create division, that create hatred and all those things. But we are in the middle of a really media revolution, so we do not yet understand enough. And even 10 years ago, when the Arab Spring was going on, I was telling my students how those social media can transform the world into democratic societies, how those medias are very good for a better world. And 2016 Brexit and all those things going along with the 2016 presidential elections and much more made us aware of dangers that come along. And I think, but it would take now a little bit more time to explain it in detail, how mimetic theory is very helpful to understand those dynamics that go along with the business model on which those social media are based. The business model is the problem.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have come to the end of this really amazing session, really thought-provoking session. Thank you so much, Wolfgang, for being here. Do you have any final parting words or anything like that?
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me. And I'm rather now going home because I'm still in the office, but I'm new to this place. So when it gets dark, I have not went home through darkness. So I'm now
Well, good luck.
eager,
Good luck
eager
getting
to go
home.
home. Oh no, there will nothing happen, but it's just the first time today.
Wonderful. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you here at the Stoa. And yeah, we'll be taking these ideas with us.
Keep on thinking and keep on discussing important matters.
Yes, it's a great thing to end on there. All right, and so I'm just going to go over a little bit of the future events that we have going on here at the Stoa. We have the Existential Kink with Carolyn Elliott tomorrow, tomorrow, January 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. You can RSVP at thestoa.ca, where you can find all of the other events, live podcasting, all sorts of things that you can do here at the Stoa. And yeah, with that, we'll close out the session. And thank you all so much for being here.